You talked a lot about his work in 20th century German history, some on his work in 19th century German history, but I would like to ask all the panelists if they could situate Showalter's characteristically excellent work on Frederick the Great of Prussia, his works in the 18th century within Showalter's other body.
I mean, I think he was asking fundamentally the same questions. What produces a military approach? How do the values and changes, the beautiful way that Rob phrased it as culture is a dynamic process. What does that do for military systems? I mean, Dennis and I used to joke about this. I used to tell him, anything pre-1789, I feel uncomfortable. Dennis could go back to 1789 BC and be just as comfortable as he was going forward. I never quite had that, so I didn't have the context really that he had in it. But as I read his stuff on Frederick the Great, it was asking the same fundamental questions. What is a state that sees itself as kind of in the middle of this dynamic European system? How does it adjust and respond to that? And again, all the work he did at staff colleges and where I first met him at the Air Force Academy, I mean, he was always looking for parallels to help people understand that this isn't a question that's just for academics. You need to be thinking about this too.
Dennis says in that book, we have a conflict. You take your commander of choice. I'll take old Fritz, and we'll see who'll be signing on the dotted line within 6 weeks.
We will see whose tank will be parked in front of the other guy's officer's club. That's another great Dennisism.
That book, his biography of Frederick the Great was, I'll just say, extraordinarily influential in my own thinking. It was about the time I was writing my book, German Way of War, which may be right, may be wrong, and I'm not blaming Dennis if it's wrong, but it led me to fundamentals, to think that perhaps there was something fundamental that spanned the centuries and patterns of German war making. I really, I'm Showalterian in my approach, I guess, because those books they get in your head and they're fundamental, and you're never really going to get away from them. But that's a forgotten book of Dennis. I'm glad you brought it up, Jeff.
Yeah. A question from Alexander Watson. A question for any or all of the speakers, because I think it links their papers. Does pre-1918 Imperial German military culture, training, command offer roots or insights for where the army ends up in the delusional last month of 1945? Is the end product simply an immediate product of Nazi fanaticism and the hopeless strategic situation of that last month? Or do speakers see longer military cultural explanations going back to the Imperial German army, as in Isabel Hull's absolute destruction? And if so, what are they?
Alexander typed all that into.
Well, it has his name on it.
So Alexander is the author of the book, is this Alexander Watson wrote the book, The Fortress?
Yes,
the award-winning book on Chemish in World War I. So thanks for that. I'll let my colleagues take it.
Yeah, so clear, there is a German way of war, and certainly we can find many continuities in the approach to German war fighting going back to Imperial Germany all the way through to 1945. So modes of thinking, structural relationships, role of staff officers, chain of command, refusal to honestly examine strategic realities. These are all fundamental characteristics of the German way of war that have those deep roots in Imperial Germany and right way back into the Prusso-German martial tradition. So absolutely.
I'd broaden it out a little bit more than that and deal with that. And it's a good example of how the commonality is, how does a losing side deal with the prospect of defeat? And now in Russell's case, we have people going off on flights of fancy. Ludendorff is about this close to a nervous breakdown by October of 1918. Or, for example, think about the American Civil War. Jefferson Davis talking about carrying forward guerrilla warfare. And, we're going to maneuver from point to point when somebody sits down and say, Jeff, it's over. Right? Have a good shot of bourbon, take some Xanax and call it a but how you deal with the prospect of defeat, that kind of lends one to engage in sort of, shall we say, flights into unreality.
I'll add one thing, if you don't mind. I think that the stab in the back is the commonality. This belief coming out of World War I amongst the Germans that they were still winning the war, and that at some point they were stabbed in the back by socialists and liberals and Jews and pacifists and vegetarians and every manner of weaklings on the home front. I think at the end of World War II, so let's assume for a moment that the German officer corps really believed that. And at the end of World War II, no one wanted to be the first officer to stand up and say, we've lost. They'd be breaking faith with the Corps. I'll mention to Alexander and to anybody else who's interested in this point, the book by the great German scholar, Herter. Is it Johannes Herter? I can't remember, it's for Hurter. And the book is called Hitler's Heerführer, that is Hitler's Army Commanders. And it's a corporate biography of all the great army commanders of World War II, all of whom, of course, were officers in World War I, and thus all of whom sort of share this body of beliefs that a war's not lost until you all agree it's lost. And as long as you don't do that, you hang on, you fight till 5 minutes to midnight, you fight till midnight, you fight till 5 minutes after midnight. And I really do think that's the commonality between World War I and World War II.
I'm actually the historian of France, so I got nothing to add to this.
Yeah, no. John.
Yeah, John Q.
Hey, John.
War College. Yeah, that trajectory there, the question I have for you guys, and it's brought up by Mike's discussion, that these things aren't founded, and the discussion of the panel that this is not cultural exceptionalism necessarily by the Germans, and of course, being a member of the cult of the Pacific, I would say, what else is out there? For me, of course, we see the same sort of behavior in the Japanese officer corps in the ND. So in looking at that and expanding on that, I think if the panel could kind of maybe address, so what are the components of that? And there are the particular components, and I know you've addressed a lot of them, but what are sort of the sign indicators that might help us recognize in our historical studies that, hey, maybe we have a case of that developing in a particular political entity or policy.
I think one of the things I admired about Dennis is, right, nothing to Dennis was ever black or white, right? Everything is tied to everything. And even the thing I love about Tannenberg is the way he starts by describing the ways in which German attitudes towards Russia were really ambivalent, right? I mean, I mean that only half jokingly about the prostitution line that Dennis used. Like that the Russians can't use a toilet, the Germans argue, but they produce kind of good prostitutes. And so the way that these things are never black and white. And Dennis also, he and I had long talks about, war and peace are not opposite ends of a coin. They're on the same spectrum. And the stereotypes, the good and bad stereotypes you have going into a conflict can then be repurposed or reshaped to create a certain kind of peace if you have people of vision that want to do it. So, again, it's like that wondrous three-sided object of Clausewitz. They're not separable from one another. They're all pushing and interacting on one another. And in that sense, Dennis made me understand Clausewitz better than any other person. That sense that it really is. It's everything ties to everything, and that's what makes doing history so hard. We as historians are not comfortable isolating independent variables because everything's dependent on everything else.
That makes us lousy political science.
It makes us lousy political science. It really does. It's half the reason we sometimes don't get along very well with political scientists. Our mindset is different.
Political scientists say to historians, we heard this morning, there's a lot we can learn from you. And historians say, yes, there is. That's so John Gentile said that this morning, so I'm just giving it. Oh, there he is, John. Good man.
So back to the question on the floor, I mean, I would say the key connection here is the centrality of the military in politics and the state, right? It's where you have the military is the fundamental central institution of government and society in politics. Then when you're so central to the state, no military can accept defeat and dissolution. So, this applies to Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, Myanmar, contemporary Myanmar today,
John, I tossed in too, I think the commonality, at least in the World War II example, is the kind of a trait of fascism, which is will. That the situation, the objective reality doesn't matter at all. You can transform the objective reality through the will, the triumph of the will. You can turn defeat into victory. And I think there, at least in that particular example, that might be the commonality, the 45 commonality.
Alexander Watson says, thank you and great answers.
Good.
Question from Charles Bogart. The World War I German army actually had a Saxon and Bavarian component. How does this fit into Prussia warfare thought?
You wrote the book.
Oh, I guess that's. I once gave a presentation on German way of war, and the paper I gave was commented on by Gerhard Weinberg. And Gerhard said, where are the Hanoverians? And all this, Robert, you may know, Gerhard is Hanoverian. So he was talking about the home folks. Well, I don't think there's much doubt that when the Reich was created in 1870 and 1871, that the smaller contingents, as you mentioned, the Bavarians and the Saxons, they were able to keep much of their own establishment, their own war colleges, so on and so forth, their own systems of promotion, of recruitment and advancement and promotion. But I don't think there's much doubt that the basics of the way of war of Saxony and of Bavaria were sort of subsumed into the broader victorious Prussian way of war. So that's how I've always argued it. And I think it'd been pretty difficult for Saxony, shall we say, to maintain some kind of independent way of war, independent methods of war making, even as there were some important regional variations. So that's, I think, probably the best answer, the short answer I could give right now.
But this book,
Dennis would have been able to give a better answer.
yeah, this book by Jonathan Boff on Crown Prince Ruprecht, if someone's really interested in the Bavarian case, that's a source to go.
And Jonathan
Excellent
Boff
source.
has written a couple of good books now. I haven't met Jonathan, but I'm very impressed with the work.
Yeah.
Good human being and great
Very
scholar.
good book. Hope he's watching.
Both. He'll get mentioned on Twitter.
There you go. Okay, so we have another question from the floor?
I'm a Bavarian. Naval War College. Get your own ride home, Kretz.
So Freudian.
He's not a
Can you say something about the role of ideology? Let's talk about that. And when you talk about the generals, it's not weeks. Those are the generals that survive the purchase and the funds after the war. So what's the role of ideology?
Yeah.
What you call delusion of decisions, but I'm wondering, at that point, is that not an army that is so poorly ideological on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. Ideology is absolutely central. So by 1945, what's left of the German military is a National Socialist military. Anyone who hadn't gotten with the National Socialist program is at minimum no longer in service, at worst in the concentration camp already dead. So it is a profoundly ideological military, and so that provides the intellectual gel that holds together the German military. They have drunk the Kool-Aid of National Socialism. Having drunk the Kool-Aid of National Socialism, they have no other recourse except to keep drinking the Kool-Aid of National Socialism. So that's absolutely fundamental. And that's why I'm saying, we blame Hitler for strategic leadership and inept strategic leadership, but everyone else had drank the Kool-Aid, and they all agreed with it. And in fact, many of them were even worse strategists than Hitler was.
Yeah, in that standpoint, I would say also that that's one of the fundamental failings of German professional military education.
Yes.
The only professional military education you got in the German army throughout the imperial period and into World War II was the Kriegsakademie, which was a 2-year program, which was the equivalent of our command and staff college. That's it. There was no equivalent of the Army War College, the Navy War College, any of the industrial college of the armed forces, any of that top-level schooling that the United States instituted in the early 20th and then in the interwar period didn't exist in Germany. So basically, the German professional military education system could produce generals who were tactically very adept, operationally in some cases gifted, but strategically they were all clueless because they never studied it, and frankly, an attempt to create a Wehrmacht academy, which would have done that, was strangled in the crib by the combination of Hitler and Goering for a variety of reasons which we don't need to get into.
Okay, so unfortunately, we're after 5 o'clock.
Oh.
So I would make two suggestions. One, that we thank our panel again. And secondly, continue the conversation and the reception after the keynote this evening.
Great.
So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.